All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited to be with you and have a chance to talk about interviewing and some of the technological trends that are impacting it in this coming year. So my name is Eric Seidel. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist with Modern Hire. And in that role, I lead our labs team, which is a team of data scientists and psychologists that analyzes data and tries to figure out how we can extract more meaningful insights from that candidate data for use in the hiring process. So we spend a lot of time exploring large data sets and figuring out how AI and other analytic tools can help us help our clients make better decisions. I will turn it over to my co-presenter. I'm joined today by Madeline Lorano. Madeline.
Thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Lorano. I'm the founder of a research company called Aptitude Research. We do research on all things HR technology related and the future of work. So this has been a very popular topic in the research that we've done over the past year. I know it's a big investment for companies as they look into 2023 and beyond. So I'm very excited to dive into some of this research, Eric, and some of the conversation that we're going to be having.
Great. Thanks, Madeline. So I'm just going to take us through a few slides of background information here, and then we'll get into some questions and discussion between Madeline and I. And, as we're doing this, I definitely encourage you all to think of your own questions and feel free to send them over. The harder, the better. You got to keep us on our toes here. So to start out, just a little bit of background information on Modern Hire. We are a hiring technology platform, and if you look at that hiring funnel on the slide there, we sort of sit in the middle. We don't work at the very top with awareness and sourcing, but once you have candidates in the funnel, we help to collect meaningful information about those candidates to help with making the hiring decision. And so we have a lot of different tools that we use to make that easier. That big circle graphic there on the left, at the center of it, it shows what we call the 4 E's. Efficiency, effectiveness, ethical outcomes, and engagement for candidates. Those are sort of the main 4 criteria by which we judge every hiring solution. And if a hiring solution only hits one or the other of those, then you need to balance it out in other ways to make sure that you're hitting all of those different key metrics. Around that, we wrap our technology and what we call cognition, which is our sort of unique brand of science that combines industrial psychology with legal expertise and HR expertise and other things of that nature. And we're continually optimizing our data as candidate data flows through our system to make the predictions stronger and stronger. Around the outside there, you see some of the tools that we offer: text screenings, assessments called virtual job tryouts, on-demand and live interviews, as well as scheduling features and things of that nature. Overall, we're a global company. We have almost 50 industrial organizational psychologists and data scientists, so lots of nerds, lots of nerdy people like myself. We also have a lot of product engineers and designers globally, lots of different languages and support all over the world. We've won a number of awards. You see some of those at the bottom of the screen there. I want to mention quickly that none of the high-tech solutions you might hear about are really any good if they don't integrate seamlessly into an ecosystem. No single hiring technology company can do it all, so to speak. And so it's really important to make sure that whatever tools you use smoothly work together for not only a good recruiter and hiring manager experience, but for a candidate experience as well. We've worked really hard to make sure that the candidates who go through our systems have a positive experience, learn something about themselves in the process, and ultimately get something out of it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about quality of hire, and this is sort of precursor to our discussion today. I've been doing this work for a couple decades now. I had the same amount of hair when I started, though. It seems like it's been a while, but we've seen a lot of transitions in that time when it comes to interviewing and when it comes to thinking about how to hire the best quality people. In the early days, early meaning about, 10 years ago, most of our clients wanted us to wait and to focus on both job performance prediction and the prediction of turnover. So they wanted people who could perform well on the job and who were less likely to turn over. As we moved into the early stages of the pandemic, everything went crazy. And, we started to have the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and all these types of things where the workforce started to disengage from the job. People didn't want to go into the office. People were reevaluating their lives. And as a result, a lot of our clients were struggling to find enough people to fill their seats. And so what happened is we went through this period that we sort of call warm body hiring, where companies tended to just hire anybody they could to fill the seats. And so they were waiting, just filling the seats over any other criteria, really throwing away the prediction of performance and also the prediction of long tenured employees, because if you're just filling seats with warm bodies, those people are probably not going to perform overly well and they're more likely to leave as well. So now, and this is sort of one of our trends for 2023, we see a shift. A lot of our clients are going back to basics and they're realizing that we need to start focusing on performance again and weighting that higher than we have in the last year or two. And so I have a little bit of an example here from some client data that we recently were able to put together. And this sort of is one way to look at the impact of warm body hiring. Now in this graphic, what you see is those blue bars on the bottom, and those are the number of hires that this client is making each month up through August of 2021. The green line at the top is the retention rate of those new hires. So you can see that it's going up and up and up kind of gradually to the right. Now in August of 2021, this client realized that they did not have enough people, that they weren't hiring enough people. And so they decided that they had to lower the bar on who they allowed to pass their hiring assessments and processes. And so they instituted a drop in their cut score, essentially, which had the effect of, and you can see it here starting in September, of letting more people through. You can see the blue bars get higher. So they dropped their cut score lower, and as a result, more people were hired. Now you can also see above that what happened to the retention rate. That went down dramatically. In fact, it went down a fairly equal amount to the increase in people that they were able to bring in. So at the end of the day, this is a situation where they didn't have enough people, so they relaxed their constraints. And as a result of that, nothing really happened because they brought in more people, but they turned over at a vastly higher rate too. This sort of illustrates the central problem with where a lot of companies were, I think, during the pandemic. What we've sort of found is that it's a more effective, long-term, better approach to continue to look at performance prediction and turnover prediction as part of your central hiring process, and to focus more of your time and attention on making the process smoother, better, faster, easier for candidates so that it's more appealing to them and they get through the process faster, and that the jobs that you offer are competitive, that the pay is adequate, that the benefits are good, that the flexibility is there, that people can work remotely or they can, work in a hybrid situation if they want. And of course, as we've seen during the pandemic, so many people reevaluated what they want out of the workplace and decided that they didn't want to commute, every single day of the week for an hour each way and all that kind of stuff. Once you have a taste of not doing that, it becomes kind of compelling. A lot of people reevaluated, and so that's sort of one of the things that we see a lot, is that companies that are hiring most effectively now have really thought deeply about what their jobs look like, what their culture looks like, what they're offering candidates. Why do candidates want to come and work there? What's the career path? How flexible is it, etc. Now, I'll show a slide here that is sort of related to the work that we do at Modern Hire that sort of speaks to the importance of more objective hiring. And this will touch on some of the topics we'll discuss later around interviewing. It's good to get rid of subjectivity in the hiring process, and it's good to inject objectivity. And so a lot of that describes the work that we do at Modern Hire with objective assessments and interview technology. And so over time, what happens is clients that use this type of solution tend to have more diverse workforces. And so what you can see here is this is a compilation of data from managerial supervisor roles. And this is showing the demographic makeup of their workforces before they started using the virtual job tryout, which is a standardized assessment that we create, and then after they started using the virtual job tryout. And what you can see is that, the role was 80% male before, and then after it increased in female percentage by 26 percentage points. And then you can see each of those racial categories, Hispanic, Black, Asian, American Indian, also increasing generally substantially across the board. And so this is not because those virtual job tryouts were specifically targeting people of minority classes or female applicants or anything like that and weighting those higher. There's nothing like that going on. All this is virtual job tryouts that were designed to objectively predict performance and help hire better quality people. And when you use that type of thing over time, it increases the objectivity and gets the human subjectivity out of the way. And it just has the net effect of increasing diversity, also increasing performance, but diversity as well. So let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of getting us into the interview world here. And so the history of interviewing is interesting, I think, because up until about 1980, throughout all of the history before then, probably from Adam and Eve or whoever, caveman or whatever, people were just interviewing each other by sitting around and talking, just chit-chatting, right? That's basically what an interview has always been throughout all of recorded history, at least until around the 1980s, when scientists started to study interviews and figure out how they could be made more effective, more valid, more predictive, more fair. And out of that work came the idea of the structured behavioral interview, which is still sort of the gold standard for how one person should interview another person. Essentially, you ask a series of competency-based, job-relevant questions, and you score what the candidate says on a rubric, on structured or on a behaviorally anchored rating scale. So whatever response I say, you listen to that and then you give it a score based on some examples that you have in front of you of a low, medium, and high score. So that makes the interview much more valid, much more objective, helps to get the subjectivity out of there. Now, in recent years, the last few years, we've been working really hard at Modern Hire on injecting AI into that process. And so AI, deep learning, natural language processing, can now take what a person says and begin to make sense of it in an automated way. And that's a pretty cool thing to see happen. And we call this capability automatic interview scoring. And basically what it does is it takes a person's response, it transcribes it into words. We don't use what a person looks like or what they sound like at all. We just take the words they say, and then those are scored against job-relevant competencies. And when we do this, what we find is that the scores that the system creates are just as useful as human ratings of those same responses, but they also are 3 to 4 times lower in group differences, meaning less likelihood of bias, getting rid of that subjectivity. So exciting time to be studying and to be working on these types of tools that have the potential to make the hiring process smoother, faster, better, and also fairer. And I think that I have been yapping too much, and I would like to turn it over to Madeline.
Thanks, Eric. I love the overview of the interviewing and how it's changed, because so much has changed. And then I think for a lot of companies, they still do interviewing the same way that they've always done it. And there's bias that's involved there. And, there's no way to really use that data to be able to make decisions around talent. It's interesting. What I'll share right now is what we found when we looked at candidate drop-off rates. And what we found is you can see 25% of companies said that most of their candidates are dropping off at the interview stage. And to me, that's so shocking because of how much money is spent on recruitment marketing. Like companies, especially over the past 3 years, have just doubled and tripled their spend on recruitment marketing. They're spending millions and millions on advertising their jobs, being able to attract talent, investing in these big CRM systems to be able to really focus on recruitment marketing. And you spend all that money, and then by the time you convert candidates to apply, they go through the interview. We found that, for a lot of companies, on average, they're doing 10 interviews for a job. And that's not even director level and above. That's just, it could be individual contributors, or it could even be hourly workers, or sometimes going through multiple interviews. So it hurts efficiency. It's hurting the candidate experience. It's definitely hurting the recruiter experience because they're often having to schedule and go back and forth there. But I think it's really interesting when you look at this slide and think about that drop-off rate. It's all that money you're investing in recruitment marketing is essentially wasted if you don't have a really standard interview process. You're using the right technology, you're thinking about structured interviewing, you're thinking about how to be efficient and provide that positive experience.
Wow, that's amazing drop-off. It's amazing number of interviews that clients are doing, and I've certainly seen a lot of articles moaning about that fact that candidates have to go through such long processes. Is there any sort of research that you've seen that explains why so many companies have such a high number of interviews?
Yeah, I think for a lot of companies, it's just how it's always been done. Like, this is how they've always done it. Sometimes hiring managers, it's not just the TA team that's kind of putting this in place. It's hiring managers can make it very difficult. I'm sure anyone in talent acquisition can relate to that. But I think, we looked at it also from the aspect of hourly workers, and that was really interesting too, because only 27% of companies even knew if hourly workers had access to transportation. You're asking people to pay for buses, pay for trains, pay for parking to come in for multiple interviews, and it's really expensive, and it's just not a consideration. So, I think for a lot of companies, it's just how that's been done. And I think it's a lot of hiring managers tend to slow that process down.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, the way it's always been done, that is always the sort of thing that gets in the way of progress, right?
Yeah. And I think the quality of hire, we're going to talk a lot about quality of hire, but I think that there's this idea that quality means more, like we're doing more, we're interviewing more, we're using more tools, we have access to more data. That means we have a better understanding of quality, and that's not the case. It's really thinking about the right technology that you need, how to think about an efficient process. All of that really contributes to quality. It's not more interviews.
Well, right. We collect all this data on candidates, and I can tell you that there's a limit to how much information you can collect that will help your decision. At some point you basically learn, look, I reveal my bookcase if I just move my arm like that behind me. At some point you just basically learn everything that is useful, and another question, another scale, another assessment isn't going to add any appreciable benefit. We just have another couple slides, and then we'll just get into the discussion part. But I just wanted to share quickly a few of the things that we do at Modern Hire to sort of blend science and technology together, in the tools that we offer. The first one is called Find My Fit, and it's sort of an interest inventory that candidates can go through to match themselves to different jobs in an organization. So it's sort of pre-apply. And the cool thing about that is that it has helped open people's eyes to jobs that they didn't realize they would fit. And one example is field service technicians, which tends to be a male-dominated role. And people's mental model of that job is that you're out in the field with, hammers and shovels and stuff, and, fixing things and climbing ladders and all this stuff. And so women tend not to apply for it. But it turns out that women are just as good and qualified for that type of job as men. And so after going through Find My Fit, the company that's on screen here is a little screenshot from Spectrum. they've dramatically increased the number of females that have applied for that role, which then has the effect of, helping to equalize, helping to make it more diverse. The other two things there are both AI-related tools that speak to the interview itself. Automated, I always alternate between calling it automatic and automated, but I think it's called automated interview creator. And this is a tool where we basically took a bunch of our industrial psychologists like me and sort of boxed them up electronically for clients to use in identifying good interview questions. So we have all this research and thinking on good quality interview questions that are highly useful. And so we basically built an expert system that clients can now log into and use to create on the fly interview guides for various positions. And then automated interview scoring on the far right there. This is the thing that I mentioned earlier where we're actually able to score what a person says or types in an interview experience and then put those scores in the online admin tools so that you can see them and sort them and so forth. So exciting, tech developments there. You don't have to use those functions if you're using our interview solutions, but they are there if you are interested in turning them on. And then finally, this is the last slide, and then it's just open discussion. And I'm sorry, but this is a bit of a shameless commercial for a book that I wrote with a couple of colleagues last year. It's been on the shelves now for a few months, called Decoding Talent, and it's basically takes some of the ideas we've talked about today and a lot of the research and thinking that we've done over the last 20 years really, and sort of presents a model of how big data and AI, advanced analytics, can really be used to fundamentally rebuild HR and talent acquisition functions, sort of from the ground up. So we try to present a kind of easy to follow and compelling blueprint for how to do that in your organization. So if you're interested, check it out. It's Valentine's Day. You could buy a copy for your significant other. It's probably not as good as flowers though, so don't do that.
Or both. Why not both?
Yeah. So those are the kind of planned slides, and we've got a number of different discussion questions here that we'll get into. And again, I encourage all of you listening to chat us questions as well.
So the first question is this is the ultimate question in talent acquisition forever and ever, is what exactly is quality of hire? And we found a lot in our research that there's been this shift, as you pointed out, from just thinking about efficiency or just thinking about how do we kind of survive what we went through in the pandemic, to now thinking really about quality of hire for the next few years and what that means. And it's not a new conversation. I mean, we've definitely been talking about quality of hire for decades, but this is the ultimate question, is how is it measured? There's no standard around it in our industry. Companies measure it very differently. A lot of the ATS systems measure it just by if somebody applied for a job or if somebody received an offer. That makes them quality. And we know that's not necessarily the case. So how do we measure quality of hire, and why is this metric so important? I mean, should we just forget this because nobody has a standard around it, or do we need to consider it?
Yeah, it's a question that's sort of fundamental to industrial psychology, to my field and to the field of many of us doing this type of work. And it's interesting because measuring quality is hard, right? And it's difficult. You have to collect data. You have to figure out what it means, and then you have to collect data on it, and then you have to look at that data and think whether it's any good or not, and work with it manually. It's difficult to fully automate that,
Yeah.
And it's messy, and it requires training in statistics and training in tests and measures and complicated things that aren't necessarily the norm. And so I think as a result of that, it's always been important, but most of hiring ignores it, right? And so it's very easy to put tools in place that are cheaper than the ones you used before, and maybe fairer, and maybe quicker for candidates to go through, and maybe easier to use, and all these types of things, pretty easy. But measuring quality difficult, and so we've just seen a lot of companies not do much with that over the years and decades. For us, in if you study psychology or industrial psychology, a lot of your coursework is around building assessments and then validating those assessments. And when you say validating, like, what does that mean? Well, it means predicting outcomes that matter for a particular job. And so, in a call center job, for example, you might be trying to predict the number of units sold. You might be trying to predict average handle times or, how productive, different productivity metrics and things like that. So what we would do is we would correlate the assessment or the interview or anything else that we have access to with those types of outcomes that actually matter and find out whether we can predict them or not. And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. So if there's things that we can't predict, we try to figure out another way to predict them. If there is a question or an assessment or an interview question that doesn't predict anything, it goes out of the system. It gets killed or revised or fixed, right? And so the whole goal is really to predict how much performance a person is going to give after they start. So for us, that's the fundamental idea of quality of hire. And again, it's like there's no easy way to automate that. There's if you are in the market for tools that predict quality of hire, you really have to look at the tool, look at the data behind it. And if you're a big enough company and you have enough people, then you can actually evaluate whether it predicts performance in your company yourself. And that is a great thing to do if you're big enough. And if you're not big enough, and you don't have a mass of people that you can use to do a study like this, right? If you're just hiring a few people here and there or whatever, then you sort of have to rely on the existing evidence that the vendor provides for that tool. But even in doing that, I think you can really dig into that and make sure that their studies are legit and based on large sample sizes, and that they've found that the higher you score on this tool, the better quality your job performance is for that specific type of job.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? It's for that specific type of job, because I think so often some of the larger systems that try to predict quality of hire, give a metric for quality of hire to companies, it's just a general, they're just finding like either retention or did they apply for the job, did they accept an offer, and they're spitting out this quality of hire metric. But the expertise in the job and what that role is so important, because the example you gave, it's going to be very different than if you're looking at sales or if you're looking at leadership positions and what quality means there. I think the other piece that's interesting to me, because I think this is the go-to for most companies, is just retention. Like if somebody stayed in the job for 6 months, that means their quality of hire. But we know that's not the case. It's not necessarily a predictor of success. And also, given everything that's happening in the economy right now, companies are going through a lot of transitions, and retention isn't a metric even for company success right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it feels like that's been the go-to. So I like this idea of like really thinking about what those metrics are and what those predictors are, and using those. And like you said, and you've said this to me before, like IOs have been doing this. This is, your bread and butter. You know how to do this, and this is part of the work that IOs do. But for a lot of HR professionals or talent acquisition professionals, this quality of hire conversation becomes very confusing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's manual work. It involves some level of analysis and statistical expertise and things like that. But at the end of the day, it makes logical sense, right? If you're hiring somebody using a certain tool, you want to make sure that that tool tells you something about that person. And so many times, because it's hard to collect quality of hire data, we just see these other metrics used in place of it, like whether the person was ultimately hired or not or whatever. It's like, that doesn't really make sense as a metric, right? Because whether they were hired or not is probably influenced by how they scored on the test in the first place. And, it's not really a very scientific test.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for companies to do better at this. And what's so cool in the data that we look at is that, that old cliche of people are your most valuable asset, right? I mean, we see this every day in the data that we look at because when a person performs better on the job, guess what? It's worth a huge amount of money to a company. When they stay longer in a job, it's often worth a huge amount of money in terms of saved turnover cost. It's very, very expensive, as probably everybody knows, when a person turns over, especially if they come on board, they weren't a great fit, but they get trained for 3 months or whatever, and then they leave and you have to replace them. And they basically contributed nothing and consumed a ton of training resources and time. Now you have to go rehire them, you have to advertise again, you have to do, it's massively expensive.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
there's just a tremendous ROI for doing it the right way.
Yeah. What's interesting too, this is like our second question, but I think it's an important one, is there's been a lot of like stories out there in the news about like, this is the year of efficiency. Like Facebook came out and said, this is the year of efficiency, and everyone's kind of using this tagline. And I think there's this idea of it's either quality of hire, it's efficiency, it's cost, what's the most important. And I've been guilty of like kind of ranking them first, second, and third myself. But do we need to do that? Or is there a way to balance quality with other things that are just as important? I mean, efficiency is just as important for companies in this time, especially in industries like healthcare and retail and hospitality. Is there a way to balance these metrics together, or do we have to kind of pick one over the other?
Yeah, I think you definitely can balance them. And I mean, I go back to the idea of the 4 E's that I mentioned in the beginning. There's really those, we've thought so much about the criteria by which a selection system should be built. Like, what are the most important things? What do companies, what do clients want? And you're right. I mean, cost, efficiency, those are always key things. Diversity, fairness is a big, big thing that has become bigger over the last several years. Quality is sort of the effectiveness piece for us. That is speaking to how well this tool actually works to hire better people. So, for me, I feel like, to me, that is sort of fundamental, because if you're hiring people for no cost and super efficiently, but you're not able to hire people who can perform well on the job, then what's the point? Like, I think about, like, what a great way to make sure that you're hiring diverse candidates is, with no bias whatsoever? Flip a coin. Just flip a coin and decide whether you're going to hire the person or not. It's completely random, so there's no bias there, but there's also no validity, right? And so you're basically just hiring whoever you want. So it's free, though. You could do, maybe cost the price of a quarter. But
somebody's going to copy this right now, Eric, and start a technology company. It's called Flip a Coin.
Right, it'd be great. It's just like a little iPhone app or something.
Yeah.
But there's no validity there either. So, so why bother? So I think that it's with. Oh, and by the way, that sort of illustrates the idea too, that you can have a hiring system that has no bias, but it may also have no validity. Right. And so then you're just flipping a coin. So I think that the point is, you really have to balance these things for an overall effective outcome. And, if we have the greatest assessment on earth that predicts quality of hire through the roof, but it takes forever and it's painful to go through, nobody wants to take it, and it costs a ton of money, that's no good either. So I think ultimately you just have to find the sweet spot. But the thing that I always throw out is, the challenge is the hardest one of these things to do is the quality piece. So if you just get rid of that piece, you're left with the others, and then you're kind of left with something that probably doesn't work very well.
Right. So the next question is, where do companies go wrong with measuring quality of hire? I mean, we talked about some of the examples where, they're either just looking at retention, or they're using these like very easy to track metrics, like did they apply? Did they accept the offer? But if companies are looking at predictors and they're looking at post-hire metrics, where often do they go wrong?
Yeah, I think that they find metrics that are easier and may not be that great. And, we talked about the one, like, sometimes you'll see whether the person was hired or not listed as an actual outcome measure that is supposed to sort of indicate quality of hire. And sometimes the company will sell that as, they're able to predict quality of hire. And then you ask, well, how did you measure quality of hire? And they say, well, we measured, whether they were extended an offer. And we're like, what? That's not the same thing. But so there's a sort of layer of marketing that I think you have to sort of try to get through sometimes to understand what was really done and what data is really there. So, in terms of really measuring quality of hire, and it does vary by position, but I used the call center example earlier because call centers are the best because they track everything in call centers. So from a data standpoint, from a studying quality of hire standpoint, it's great. It's like a cornucopia, right, of data. So all this, I don't know if it's great to be tracked that way as a human, but it's great for the analyst to have, access to this type of data. And so a lot of jobs, my job, your job, a lot of people on the call probably don't have clear metrics like that they're tracked on. So it becomes more difficult. So what do? Well, I think that the best answer we really have is performance ratings. And I don't mean the kind of performance ratings that are historically traditionally done where, once a year you sit down with your manager and you get rated on a gazillion things and that kind of thing. Those types of ratings tend to not work very well as criterion metrics because most people, if you look at the variation on those types of ratings, on a 1 to 5 scale, everybody gets a 4, right? A couple people get a 1 and then they are on their way out the door and, a couple people get a 5 and that's it. Most people get a 4. And so those are basically not very useful from a validation, from the perspective of studying quality of hire. And what we do is we deploy separate questionnaires, separate rating processes just to validate an assessment or an interview. And so those are done specifically for that purpose and they're confidential. The person who's being rated doesn't see it and it doesn't impact them at all. And that actually helps a lot to get better quality ratings variation. Now, I would say too, like more recently, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of this, but there's a lot of companies doing innovative things in the performance management space with more, shorter, real-time, easy
ongoing feedback.
Ongoing feedback. Yeah. And I love that stuff. I mean, so that type of data can really be useful, I think, in helping to bridge this gap of, not having enough criterion outcome data. Sorry, I always use the word criterion when what I mean is performance data. That's the nerdy term for it.
The IO term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. So let's shift a little bit and talk about intelligent interview, because this is how kind of we talk about interviewing now, is intelligent interviewing. And that's, where companies are going to get the data. That's where quality of hire becomes a reality for a lot of organizations. But what is an intelligent interview and why is it important? And is it technology that's the intelligent interview? Is it something the company actually has to do?
Yeah. I think we mean it in a technological sense, largely. But, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of the structured behavioral interview as a way that one person can interview another person, forget about technology, that's still a good idea. That is still a good approach. And in the absence of technology, that is the way to go. And basically, it forces you as an individual to sort of act like a robot. Because instead of just chit-chatting with a person and talking to them about whatever you want, oh, Madeline, that's a cool picture behind you. Where do you get that? No, that's not one of the questions. So you're sticking to a regimented routine of job-relevant questions that have been pre-identified, and you give a response, and I evaluate it based on a clear indicators that I have written down here, And that's great because that actually helps the interview to be a lot more objective and valid and fair. But I think the opportunity now comes in with technology to help automate that process. So that the process itself, when it's done right, is great. But who among us is perfect at that anyway? Because we still deviate, we still take in more information than we maybe should, or evaluate subjective factors more than we should. And I think of us humans as just bias machines, probably because of my, the psychology background and the work that I've been doing for 20 years, studying these things, like we have a lot of biases, just baked in, built in, and it is super, super hard for any person to, make decisions without those biases. And so along comes technology, and lo and behold, computers are now good enough. And when I say computers, what I really mean is algorithms, deep learning, natural language processing stuff is good enough to be able to take what a person says or types and score it, on a particular competency, which is really the computer being able to understand the meaning of what a person says. That's the technology point that we're getting to now, where computers can understand what we mean and rate it on, certain qualities. So that's pretty exciting. And, as I mentioned earlier, I think in our data, we've seen that the way we develop this has dramatically lowered group differences. So and I don't think that any company, us included, has, perfected this yet. But I do think that it's to a point where it's a significant value add, can make the hiring process faster, easier, and certainly more fair and more objective.
Yeah, and I think this, idea of the context, putting context behind what people say, and then the combination of the interview and the assessment together is, where companies are really going to see the value. And we found even that companies were using on average 5 different solutions for interviewing, which is crazy. It's like the interview management, the scheduling, multiple scheduling tools, maybe different assessments, and that's all collecting data differently. That context becomes really challenging. So to be able to have one platform, I think makes a big difference.
Yeah, a lot of the research in industrial psych has always shown that the best way to make a decision about who to hire is a combination of a good assessment that's job related and validated scientifically, and an interview, a structured interview, and so you combine those two things together and you're really covering most of the bases. And not 10 interviews, but one, maybe 2, but not 10 interviews. And going back to that 10 interview comment you made earlier, I feel like that type of thing is to some extent the result of companies not knowing what they want in a candidate, right? They're not sure. I'm not sure. So I'm going to have my colleague interview you too, and then my boss, and then my boss's boss, and then his, whatever, right? Because we want to spread the responsibility around since we don't really know what we want, right? And so I think that when you go into hiring for a position, being clear about what that role is supposed to accomplish and how, and that's the start of our process anyway, when we create an assessment or an interview, is understanding, okay, what is the target? What does good performance look like for this role? Once you know that, you identify assessments, you identify interview questions, you put together the method, and then you're good. You've got basically the best approach you can have, the most scientific approach. Make a decision. You don't have to go through 10 interviews. You should not have to go through 10 interviews, to make that decision. And if you're doing that, it probably speaks to a larger problem.
It's such a basic question. I mean, that is the first question you start with. And so many companies, and honestly, so many hiring managers don't ask that question, but what does good look like in this role? So I think that it's, a lot of it, to your point, like when we started, was getting back to the basics with some of the stuff.
Yeah.
So what should companies consider when evaluating providers? I mean, I think there's some great examples already that you've provided, but, we did a panel with a few modern hire customers, and I love this response that they answered here. One I'll share was actually Spectrum, and it was Laura Fields, and she said that when evaluating providers, she, especially for interview and assessment providers or AI providers, she looks at the leadership team to see if there are IOs that are on staff. And I think that really kind of speaks to this whole conversation around quality of hire and intelligent interviewing.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, well, I certainly like that response. Works for me. But I think that one of the things that's just so important in my mind is separating marketing from scientific results. And for a long time, AI, for the last few years, AI has been all the hype, right? All the rage. And I've always thought, well, the hype around AI is about a decade ahead of the actual science. So it's just so easy to look at marketing claims and think, that's great, I want to buy that. And so what I always counsel people is to, stop for a second and dig into those claims and see what is behind them. And do they really make sense? Because it's not like every company out there is using, rigorous scientific methods to develop their HR technology tools. And that applies for whatever company you're talking to, including Modern Hire. You should always be an educated consumer and ask questions about how did you get to that result, and really try to understand whether it is legitimate, and also then whether it will apply to your company. Okay, you built a tool of some sort that saved money, and there's a statistic on your website that it saved $1 million for a company. Okay, great. What was the situation? What was the tool? When was this? How many people were in the study that you did? What job was it for? And you need to know this type of information. You need to ask these types of questions to try to understand whether that is likely to be the same result or a similar result, that you'll get. And I think there's a real scientific literacy thing that is very, very helpful when evaluating vendors. And I mean, it's only getting more complicated because now we have AI. No one understands AI, right? No one understands the nitty-gritty of how a particular algorithm works in 100% detail, right? AI is very difficult to comprehend. It's very opaque. It's sort of like, you hear it described as like replicating the way the human brain works, which is sort of true, I think. But it's complicated. You can understand how it was built, how it was coded, and how it and the outcomes it predicts, but still not really fully understand everything that's going on inside of that black box. So, and I've heard so many stories about companies that claim various things, and hey, we're using AI to do this, and what AI technique are you using? Let me get back to you. So that's not the type of response you want. You want to dig in and really understand.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. There's a question that came in about AI and verbal communication. What about when verbal communication is important for certain jobs in an interview and in the decision making? How does AI help with that?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, when we score interviews, we just take the text. We just take the words, rather, that a person says and score that. And the reason we don't use the audio wave file itself or the video is because those are just filled with too many biasing factors. And so we remove all that stuff and we look at just the words, because those are the things that a candidate wants you to have. Those are the things that the candidate is giving you to freely use in the hiring decision. If I interview for a job, I don't really want you to use my hair or lack thereof as, or my accent or whatever. Those are things that are there and we all know they're there, but I don't really want the decision based on those types of factors, right? So to be as, fair and least invasive of privacy, we prefer to use just the words. Now, for a job that requires communication, certainly, interviewing is relevant, and it certainly is warranted that a person be able to communicate adequately and be understandable and be a good speaker if the job calls for that. I think it just comes down to whether the job calls for that type of capability.
Great. There's a question too about using automation and AI for filtering candidates and the impact that has on diversity, equity, and inclusion and bias. I think there's been examples of companies that have done that and then obviously have not accounted for bias within that. How do you kind of think about the role technology plays with, that diversity piece and these qualities that a company identifies, but also making sure that everybody has a fair and equitable experience through the process?
Yeah, that is a great question. I was figuring we'd probably get some kind of question like that. That is a big topic that's being discussed everywhere, and I have yet to see the perfect answer for it. I think that we've made a lot of progress in hiring and in hiring technology over the last several years, and AI has really helped with that. And when we use it in a specific way, like I mentioned with automated interview scoring, those scores are very low in bias, much lower than human scores would be. Now, I think there's also been a hugely increased focus on the DEI stuff, over the last few years. And, I don't know that I've seen an approach that completely solves that yet. Certainly, there is a need for accommodations, for candidates to be very available and obvious and easy to get. And when a candidate needs an accommodation, they need to be given an accommodation. It's difficult to, I don't think that problem has been completely solved, but the question of does AI cause these problems? That's the interesting thing. I think poorly developed AI can certainly exacerbate group differences and magnify bias. If it's poorly built. It can also help remedy bias and get rid of it if it's built well. And I think in the early days of AI, and you still see this some today, there's AI tools that are out there that are not really studied adequately. And as a result, they replicate a bias that's inherent in society at scale and make it worse, right? Through the use of automation. They're automating a bias. And so that's very bad. But AI is just statistical analysis, right? So it can be done in a better way if you are studying it properly and making sure that it's evaluating objective things that are related to the job. It works very well. I mean, it's powerful statistics is really how I think of AI. So it's not inherently evil. It's such a powerful tool that can be used. A hammer can be used to build a house or to tear one down, right? So
Right.
It's how the tool is used. And I think that the big thing, and this is a thing that consumes a lot of my time, is thinking about how we as a society and as a company harness AI to make our world better for humans, right?
Yeah.
And it can do that, but we do have to harness it. We have to be very careful that it's not poorly developed, because in that scenario, then it can certainly, add to bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this idea of AI for good is definitely, happening and a reality for a lot of companies, but it depends on the providers and it depends on how companies are using it too. So it's both on the provider and on the organization.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this is great. I always learn so much when I talk to you, Eric. So I feel like I could keep going, but I know we're close to time here. There may have been a few more questions coming in, but we can certainly follow up with anyone that sent questions that we didn't get to. So thank you all for the amazing questions. Thank you, Eric, for all of your insights. And
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you to HR executive.
Yeah, and feel free to follow up. I'll speak for Madeline here with either of us. Contact info on the screen there, but love to chat further if there's questions and things we didn't get to.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.